Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Doug O'Brien, the Executive Vice President of Programs at NCBA CLUSA, and I want to welcome you to this important and I think you'll find very timely conversation about the power of cooperative ownership in the Black community here in the United States. I want to talk just for 1 minute about NCBA CLUSA and about what we do and why we're so excited to host the conversation in the panel today. NCBA CLUSA has been around for just over 100 years, founded in 1916, and it's the primary voice in the United States for using the cooperative model for building a better world. We serve and work with over 100 million cooperators across the United States in all types of cooperatives, credit unions, mutual insurance companies. And one of the things we like to do beyond, we also work across 19 countries in food security, resilience, cooperative development. And we like to lift up how cooperatives make an impact on the economy and society and how they can help answer some of society's most critical questions. I want to point to a postcard that you all had on your seats on a major conference that we're hosting in Alexandria in October that will just do that, go deep into looking at how cooperatives impact society, impact the economy, and look at how they fit in today's societies, both the challenges and the opportunities. I also want to mention that today's conversation about how co-ops can and have in the past worked in the African American social and economic movements, I think is so timely today because of some of the challenges that we are facing as a society, whether it be inequality and poverty, the need for more resilient communities, and indeed empowering people in their businesses and in their economy. We have much to learn from those cooperators in these past 200 years that have worked within and are of the African American and Black community. So with that, I just want to again welcome you. Thank you for being here today. And I want to hand it over to Ellis Carr, who's the president and CEO of Capital Impact Partners and one of the board members for NCBA CLUSA. Ellis.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be back in front of you all today. I moderated a panel about this time last year and always happy to be back with you again. Especially happy as we celebrate Black History Month. As you know, this is a time where we are reminded of and honor the significant contributions that African Americans have made to this country. And I'm really happy that we're able to be together today. Oftentimes, when we do stop and pause and reflect, we often do just that. We reflect on the past. But today, we'll look to the present and the future and finding ways for and discussing and exploring how cooperatives can really empower African American communities across the country. Today, I am honored to have 4 dynamic individuals with me at the stage. To my immediate left is Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, professor at John Jay College and author of Collective Courage, A History of African American Economic Thought and Practice. Welcome. Cornelius Blanding, executive director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. LaKeisha Wolf, executive director of the Ujamaa Collective. And our very own Alex Serrano, Vice President of Strategic Development for NCBA CLUSA. Welcome. I think you all have their bios with you, so we won't go through too much of their backgrounds. But before I turn it over to the panel, I just wanted to give you a quick run of show today. First, each panelist will give a short presentation, about 5 to 7 minutes each. We'll have a nice little fireside chat with yours truly. We'll do a few Q&A with our panelists here. Then we want to hear from you. We'll turn it over for some Q&A from the crowd, and then we'll wrap up. So again, really happy to have all of you here, and I'll just turn it over to Jessica to kick us off.
And I guess we're staying here, right? We're
Yes.
sitting here. Okay, thanks. Thanks to the organizers, NCBA, for having me. I'll start with acknowledging the original occupants of the land, as well as all our ancestors, and especially those who labor without just compensation. I stand on the shoulders of those who use cooperation for liberation. So why are cooperatives a good strategy for economic development and revitalization? It's because of the way they deliver multiple economic, social, and psychological benefits to their members and to the communities that they serve. We need to figure out ways that we can increase and produce more cooperatives of all kinds, but also to increase the production and service that we get through them. When I wrote Collective Courage, I was writing a book to make sure that we understood that there was a cooperative economic movement among African Americans, and to understand that better, as well as to document specific cooperative enterprises. So I was looking at the practice, where did we actually practice economic cooperation and have cooperatives, as well as what the thought was, when and how are we talking about using cooperative economics for the betterment of African American communities. The book Collective Courage covers hundreds of mutual aid societies, which are precursors to the cooperatives, Black communal towns, and examples of formal and informal economic cooperation, basically from around 1780 to 2013. I cover over 162 legally incorporated cooperative enterprises owned by African Americans throughout the continental United States, both the North and the South, from the mid-1880s to the present. Plus, I refer to about 20 credit unions and 154 co-ops that W.E.B. Du Bois studied in his 1907 study called Cooperative Economics Among Negro Americans. Of course, I'm missing co-ops, right? That's not the extensive list of the co-ops that have existed or that exist, but it gives you an example of this long heritage and the history of some of the at least best documented of the co-ops. There's a lot that haven't been well documented. Many of the co-ops were grocery and agricultural co-ops. Many were credit unions and housing co-ops, but there were also some worker co-ops, cotton mills, sawmills, other factories. We even had some healthcare or health insurance co-ops, craft co-ops, catering, cleaning, etc. Most of them were started because African Americans were discriminated against in the mainstream markets. And in the stores and factories, they either couldn't get the kinds of supplies and loans they needed, or they couldn't even get work in those other businesses. And sometimes dire need caused people to come together. But it was a way to own and control enterprises without that exploitation and discrimination that was happening in the wider economy. It also took courage to persist, to engage in an alternative, to try to do something different, to share money, to make those kinds of decisions. It took courage to take a route that wasn't in the mainstream, and it also took courage when there were actual terrorist forces trying to stop you and killing your members and burning down your buildings, etc. So the story is not just about the triumph, the survival and the triumph of co-ops in the Black community, but it's also about the sabotage and the challenges. I have about 7 main findings, and then I'm going to stop so you can hear from my colleagues. So as I said earlier, co-ops were used both for survival and for economic independence. Sometimes the same co-op, and sometimes some co-ops were used for survival, and other co-ops created more economic independence. African Americans used African retentions and notions of cooperativism and self-help in the movement to create and operate cooperatives. We also used our sense of racial solidarity and community support, meaning we didn't operate isolated co-ops. We operated cooperatives that also connected with communities in a myriad of ways, often solving community problems, but also connecting to communities and getting community support. The importance of organizations. Most of the co-ops were either started by or supported by or used education programs by Black organizations. Fraternal organizations, religious organizations, educational organizations, labor organizations, social organizations were all important throughout this history. It's one of the common threads. And in fact, the most prolific periods of time, the 1880s, the 1930s to 40s, and the 1960s through 70s, were the periods when I found the most Black co-ops, and all those periods are characterized by strong Black organizations, particularly political and social organizations. Those periods also sometimes have economic challenges in common, like the 1880s and the 1930s. Sometimes they have strong populist and progressive movements in common, like the 1880s and the 1960s, but also the 1930s are sort of progressive in there also. But having strong organizations that are promoting cooperative development and cooperative education were important. The importance of study groups. Almost all the cooperatives started with a study group and then practiced continuous education. They used information from the mainstream, but also created their own information. They had strategies for low wealth members so that member equity could be paid in installments and other ways to help. You didn't have to always have enough money to join. You just had to have the interest and energy to be a member. Using non-market resources like sweat equity, social capital, motivation, enthusiasm, and trust were often what kept the co-op successful. And they were a way to distribute resources, control land, means of production, economic decisions, to keep those in the hands of a wide variety of members, Black women and youth in particular. The strong role for Black women, involvement of youth were really important. And then connection to social justice movements, so that you'll see the history of African American cooperativism is really a parallel, sort of a silent partner to the long civil rights movement. So anywhere where we found people working toward Black liberation, we also found a strategy for using cooperatives, cooperative ownership, cooperative economic independence as either the base or as one of the pieces of the strategy to gain more liberation for African Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Taking a little bit of moderator's privilege, just want to ask you one quick follow-up question before we get to Cornelius. I was struck by your comment around African Americans needing to be courageous. And when you think about today, relative to history, a lot of people may think that things have changed significantly where others may not say it's changed at all. Can you talk a little bit about how African Americans need to be courageous in today's time?
Well, actually, I've been telling my students that we're in a similar period to the 1880s. So if you know history, the 1880s were a period of regression in terms of civil rights and racial justice. We had the Reconstruction after the Civil War. Reconstruction was a period, it was actually the first civil rights period, if you want to get technical. Blacks were able to vote. A lot of the systems of slavery and stuff had been broken down, and there was much more Black activity. After 1877, the country reverted back to being racist and white supremacist and exploitative, and the 1880s were a time when unions and populist movement were all fighting not just for worker rights, not just for agrarian and small farmer rights, but also the Black groups were also working for Black political rights. And again, they saw that that struggle was intimately related to controlling your own economic businesses and controlling your own, owning land and controlling businesses, having some economic independence with which to fight politically. And I would say we're in a similar, obviously it's not the 1880s anymore, but we're in a similar political position where things are going regressive, but there's a lot of populism, right? A lot of local activity, a lot of people already thinking about how to take local control, and this is a time when we need to take more of that. And the courage was, again, very similar to what we're going to have to do now, which is there was lots of periods where if you were observed doing something out of the traditional and alternative, you could be attacked, as I said, physically. You could be lynched, shot, your business or your company or your land could be burned down or burned or whatever, but people continued to do it. They found ways to operate underground, so you weren't as obvious, but there were some people who were willing to be out in the forefront and make the challenge that needed to happen. And so I think it's another period where we can work very grassroots and locally to provide that base and as much independence as we can, but we're going to have the courage to continue to fight for the things we know are the right things to do.
Thank you very much. Cornelius.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for the invitation to NCBA CLUSA. Thank you for the opportunity to represent the Federation of Southern Cooperatives on this panel and talk about this important topic. When I'm called to speak, I usually start with a quote from Malcolm X, and it's, I'm not a very educated man, nor am I expert in any particular field, but I am sincere, and my sincerity are my credentials. And I usually say that to lower expectations, because quite often I stumble over some words and I might quote some things that I might not write, and there's quite a few people on this panel who know a whole lot more than me and in this audience. And so I'm just humbled by the fact of being able to represent such an organization like the Federation on such an important topic. Yep. I usually sit behind Jessica on things, and that's another disadvantage I'm always at. Jessica is so well researched, and I'm not. But again, I'm sincere. And so, Jessica quite often talks about a couple of different periods where there was a growth in cooperatives in the Black community. Sure. And two of those I'm familiar with, we're as a federation are familiar with, because they played a crucial role in terms of our organization. And so I pick up in terms of the 30s, which was the resettlement programs at that time, that during the Great Depression, which there were these resettlement communities. And two of those resettlement communities played a major role in the Federation. One of them was in Alabama, in Alberta, Alabama, with the Freedom Quilting being a community there. And the other one was down in Mississippi with the Mousen Co-op. And two of those resettlement communities, unlike many of the others, continue to thrive and survive today. Those two resettlement communities were founded on cooperative principles, so they lasted. They were two of the founding members of the Federation. In the 60s, you had OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, under Johnson, and there was the War on Poverty, and there were cooperatives that started springing up that were supported by OEO. Many of those co-ops that started in the 60s were also founding members of the Federation. The Federation is nothing more than a cooperative association of Black farmers, landowners, and cooperatives all around the South. Our movement was started at the grassroots level. That stemmed out many of those programs, so there was government support, there was a necessity, and there were a lot of turmoil economically, politically, and socially that were going on in our communities. But those cooperatives, 22 of them, with the assistance from many others, including NCBA CLUSA, who was at the first meeting in 1966, when co-ops from Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee started talking about the idea of a cooperative. You had people from the International Self-Help Alliance and others, the Regional Cooperative Alliance, and other people that came to help spur that conversation. And there were dollars that were, Ford was one of the first foundations that a grant was submitted. But the money came from OEO and others, where 22 co-ops formed this organization they called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund. But the purpose of the Federation was simple. There was 22 major purposes, and I won't get into them all, but it was about being mutual benefit for those cooperatives and their members to promote, protect, and defend the cooperative movement in the South. which I imagine came out of CLUSA. But again, there were a lot of people that played a major role, and these cooperatives sprung up based on necessity. And they came together for a bigger cause. As an organization, our focus then and our focus now is still around three things: cooperative economic development, land retention, and advocacy. And so when I talk about this organization, I talk about those things that were important, those reasons why we are, our reason for being, if you will. And one of them is there was a lot of economic exploitation and discrimination in our communities, and cooperatives were an answer for that. You had farmers in Tennessee who couldn't buy gas, who had to go across state lines to buy gas as a cooperative. You had women in Alabama who didn't have jobs, who were being kicked out, who were being fired because they were registering to vote, who created quilting bees. You had farmers in Mississippi and in Louisiana who had to organize trucks because they were being discriminated against, and they were getting a lower price than some of the white farmers, and they went into the trucking business. They created cooperatives out of necessity. So cooperatives were a tool for us then and now, as Jessica pointed out, in terms of because the pendulum is swinging back. But there were explosions of cooperatives during periods of necessity, but they always happened in conjunction with a lot of other support from the cooperative community and others, and even with government support. And again, I mentioned the resettlement program in OEO. So as an organization, we realized long ago that we had to organize around solutions for economic exploitation and, again, racial discrimination. But the other fact, land, the importance of land, and I quote these, I quote some statistics for you, which is another reason for our being. According to the Census Bureau, in 1910, there were 218,000 black farmers owning roughly 15 million acres of land. By 1992, almost the turn of the century, there were only about 18,000 black farmers owning about 2.3 million acres of land. In 1982, the Commission on the Civil Rights commissioned a report that said by the year 2000, if things didn't change with the government, which was a major reason why a lot of these farmers lost their land, there would be no black land in the year 2000. And so one role of our organization has been to stem that tide and to fight that issue. And so our reason for being around those two things, economic exploitation and the trend of land loss. And so again, we do that through cooperative economic development, land retention, and advocacy. But we're nothing more than an association of those co-ops, those landowners, those farmers together in the South using cooperatives as a tool for ownership, a tool for infrastructure, and a tool for being. And it has allowed this organization to last for 50 years. And we celebrate our 50th year in August in Birmingham and Epps, Alabama. So there's an invitation for you all to come, and we hope to see you there. So this is a milestone for us, and we look forward to celebrating and hope we get a chance to see many of you at that celebration.
Great. Thank you, Cornelius. As a grandson of a farmer in Alabama who owned his own land in the 60s, I can really relate to a lot of the things that you said. Can you just talk a little bit about, in today's time, how you're engaging your members and what are some of the top things on their mind in terms of managing?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the same we've been engaging them since the 60s. We have some of the same issues. So let me start on one side in terms of the cooperative side. So again, cooperative development has been a tool for us for gaining independence, for developing infrastructure and other things in communities. But unfortunately in the South, there are no good cooperative laws. And so we wrestle with that a lot. And so many of our members are structured as nonprofits and other forms of business. And on the surface, it doesn't seem to cause a problem because they have cooperative bylaws. But when you dig deeper, there is a major problem. And let me talk about it as a nonprofit as an example. For many of you know, as a nonprofit, when a nonprofit dissolves, the assets of that nonprofit must go to another nonprofit. With cooperative, and so you have cooperative members who lose assets just by the mere fact of the way they're structured. And that has happened in our case with things like credit unions. When credit unions have merged, they've lost property and significant assets that the community has built up. So we fight for cooperative laws, and we're still fighting to try to build cooperative laws in the South. But unfortunately, the South, there's a lot of obstacles in our way, and they're so closely aligned, and people in the South and legislators compare them to unions. And so, you know, in the South, it's right to work states, and they fight against unions, and so they therefore fight against cooperatives because there's no understanding of cooperatives. So that's one of the issues we constantly deal with as an organization. But as our members, we're always educating about cooperatives. The cooperative principles is a constant. There's constant education required because you're working in some of the most economically deprived communities, and that education is important in understanding that concept, understanding business, and understanding how to protect assets. But the cooperative tool is one of the major ways that we've been able to gain assets in our communities, and the Federation is one example of that. It's community asset ownership. And I started talking about roughly 1,300 acres that this organization, which is again comprised of all these cooperatives, all these farmers, there's 1,300 of acres that has managed to attain and hold on to over those 50 years.
That's great. So many more questions, but we'll come back. LaKeisha.
Hi. I do want to say thank you so much to NCBA, and Jessica, of course, for inviting me here and putting my name in the hat. I'm very grateful. The Ujamaa Collective, we are a nonprofit, and we have some issues with that as well that we can talk about a little bit later. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got started. Essentially, almost 10 years ago now, it was about 2008. And I know most folks, if you think about Pittsburgh, you know about the Pittsburgh Steelers. You may think about the hockey team. And then in the last couple of years, you know, Pittsburgh has been on the rise, and folks know it as one of the most livable cities. However, that is not true for African-American people as a whole in the city of Pittsburgh. And so at the time, on a microcosmic level, in the neighborhood of the Hill District, it is a historic African-American neighborhood that has a large sort of cultural legacy around arts and culture and business. And this is a community that has a history of displacement, probably going back to about the 1800s or so. But maybe about 10 years ago, the Pittsburgh Penguins got ownership or really development rights of a huge parcel of land in which about 500 or so businesses and home owners and folks had been displaced from about 50 years prior to that. And so during that 50 or so years, there had been sitting there the Civic Arena, then it became the Mellon, where they would do light shows, concerts, and whatnot there. But that displacement of people over those 50 plus years had drastically changed the sort of landscape of Pittsburgh. And so families for like decades and for generations had been really still feeling the sort of aftermath of that. So here we are, Black women in Pittsburgh, most of us very much low income, and we're artists, we're handmade artists. I myself make jewelry and have a line of skin and hair care products. And most of us would vend, go to different events or whatnot, and usually we're waiting for other people to hold these sort of functions for us to go and kind of make our way and make our money. What was happening in the Hill District was that the Pittsburgh Penguins had gotten this land, and the community had started to sort of push back, because what was happening was that the city and the Penguins were saying, we're going to put a casino in the Hill District, which would have, you know, for a community that had already been devastated, it would have taken us, you know, I don't even know what that would have really looked like. It just horrendous results. And so there was a lot of political upheaval at that time. And a lot of the Black women who were leading different groups in the Hill District were kind of pushing back. And so it was pretty much a fight around money and like resources in the city. And so as artists, we saw ourselves kind of as the folks who can, you know, use art as this tool to kind of express what is going on, right? And so we saw ourselves as making a difference in the, just basically saying we can use our own resources and pull ourselves sort of away from what's happening and do something on our own. And so what we decided was we would create this marketplace. That was sort of the original concept. And when Black women began to sort of like organize around this concept, we started to look at sort of examples of what had been done in the past. And in Pittsburgh, and in my experience, I had worked at the East End Food Co-op, which really was the only co-op that folks even knew about, was the food co-op in Pittsburgh. And I had worked there and had the chance to visit a lot of different like conferences. Is when I heard about the Federation. I met Jessica, and I said, you know, we really need to put some of these practices into place. And when we started to do some research, we recognized that for us, as folks who were more sort of like African-centered in our thought, we started looking at what was happening in other parts of the world. And what we did was we discovered that, you know, the concept of cooperation as a practice and really as a business model had its roots way, 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 way back. And so we recognized, because when I would go to these conferences, what was being presented to me was, oh, you know, co-op started in, you know, Europe, and this is where the inception was. And for me, it just didn't really make sense, right? And so as we began to do our own research, we recognized, hey, Kwanzaa, the concept of Ujamaa, right? The fourth principle is what we're talking about here, is where we pulled the name from. And we looked at examples in Tanzania, and specifically we were looking at Nigeria and looking at examples pre-colonial ways in which women were making money. And the marketplace very much was where women ran the market. And the practices that we pulled forward, specifically the two that really got us moving, one was called the Esusu. It's spelled E-S-U-S-U, which is still practiced today, and is one practice that many of our members in Pittsburgh began to tell us about because they're from the Caribbean. And so they said, hey, this is one practice that from Nigeria through the transatlantic slave trade was able to be retained. And so a lot of women and families across the Caribbean still practice this. And so we had members who were from Jamaica and from Trinidad who said, oh, my mom, my grandma have always practiced this sort of money rotation system, and this is how we sent our children to college, this is how we built our first house, this is how we did all of these different things. And so what we began to do in Pittsburgh as low-income women who were artists, we began to practice the Esusu. And I would say probably in like 2.5 to 3 years, we rotated close to $18,000 amongst ourselves. And I'm talking about women who, you know, when we would do this rotation, you probably had 20 women with the $10 hand every week or two rotating this money. And again, you know, these are practices that are very much about trust building, about commitment, about recognizing that something is way greater than yourself, right? It's more about the collective interest than the self-interest. And I think that it's difficult sometimes to make that shift. A lot of our members at the time were actually older. So I'm in my late 30s now, but obviously almost 10 years ago, I was coming into my early 30s, and I was one of the youngest members in the group. I didn't even have children yet at that time. And so it was very interesting because you had women who were a lot older who recognized the importance of it, but still sometimes had a harder time making a shift because, you know, Pittsburgh can be a very, you know, it's the steel city because of the steel, but also because of some of the hard, like, rigors and work ethic attitudes that you've had to kind of developed in in order to push through. And so as we began to build our collective, we were doing the marketplace from about the spring to every fall for 3 or 4 years. But our members, we recognized that our members needed business training, and so we began offering that. And we also were practicing what's called the ESUSU, which is a sort of labor sharing model as well, and began to support each other's business growth. If I was having, a jewelry show, members would come and work for me and vice versa, and so we would share work in that way. But as we began to grow, before we actually registered as a business of any kind, we went back and forth about should we be for-profit or should we be nonprofit, or what should we do? And there wasn't really a lot of information available locally on co-ops. I knew one woman who had done some research. I think she had studied for a while in Madison, and probably was the most knowledgeable about it and kind of helped us out at the very beginning. But we decided, because we also had so many sort of activist modes and things that we wanted to do, and we had some friends who were in the foundation community, we said, let's go and do the nonprofit route, because we still, as a nonprofit, can support all of the businesses that all of our members have, underneath this collective umbrella. But we can get some of the foundation support and some of these grants to get us moving, right? Because we recognized that we needed a lot of resources, initially to get us going. And so today, what's really the flagship of what we do is we have this beautiful boutique, which is in the central business corridor of the historic Hill District. And we really find ourselves doing more. People see our shop and are like, oh, wow, this is beautiful. But folks don't recognize some of the work that goes on behind these beautiful walls and this artwork that's on the shelves. And so we've been doing a lot of global engagement. I always tell people that we sort of meet at the crossroads of art and culture and business, and that, art is a beautiful way to get into some of the conversations that are really difficult to have around poverty. Some of the things or some of the research that we discovered at the beginning of our journey really helped us to know that we were going in the right direction. And in Pittsburgh, what we discovered were several studies that came out. One that talked about the median wealth for Black women was $5 compared to white women, which was $42,000. So that was number one, and we were like, whoa, this is the reason why cooperative strategies are extremely important. Two is there was a study, and I don't have my notes with me, so if anyone has any questions, I can get that information later. Two was a study that came out that talked about the quality of life and life expectancy of Black women in Pittsburgh was equivalent to women in developing countries, such as Guatemala, I think Trinidad, and a third country that was referenced in that study. And so what we recognized was that, and what still is an issue, is that, just as you mentioned, a lot of people are so unaware of cooperatives and put it in this box that it's not a real business, or it's not a real path to wealth. And we found it to be different. Our members, in my opinion, not only do they make more money, but I think that the benefit that we have to our community is so much greater. And we're talking about a community that has lost so many people and so much business. So we're one of the only really viable business on our street, essentially. And the Hill District is such prime property that development has been sort of at a standstill. It's happening, but the community is so rooted in making sure that there is benefit to the people who live there that they've halted a lot of things from happening, knowing that the gentrification is very real, and the impact of that going forward would be truly detrimental to what's already been done over the last several decades. And so I can answer more questions a little bit later. I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you so much, LaKeisha. I mean, a couple things that you just said that resonate that I want to come back to when we get into Q&A. The first is looking beyond the U.S. for inspiration, Tanzania, Nigeria, and others. And then I want to revisit this concept around community. You talked a lot about it, but I think we need to really explore that a little bit more, because I got the sense of a rich culture, community rich in history and culture. You talked about, roots from Africa, roots from the Caribbean, et cetera, and bringing all those together to create what you all have now is really special, so I want to revisit that. Alex, let's turn it over to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Until last week, I'm going to tell you, I knew very little about the role of cooperatives in the African American community here. I've been in this country for quite a few years. Most of my work has been international in Africa. So I started looking at it and I started to figure out, okay, there are a lot of similarities in the work we do around the world, and particularly in Africa, and the cooperatives in the African American community, particularly in the early stages. And so as I start really learning from what Jessica, Dubois, and all the work that has been done, it's really remarkable to see the similarities. And so I hope to maybe focus my presentation more about the experiences that I've had and we've had worldwide. I also like to talk about one era, particularly the African American era, that is very close to CLUSA, to NCBA CLUSA. And then maybe discuss a little bit, if not a roadmap, at least some things that we could be doing going forward. But one thing that really has impressed me, and obviously shouldn't because history is very hard, but it's really the African American community has to be one of the communities that has such adversity, that have fought so many things. Maybe only the Native Americans that were almost exterminated had even the worst deal. So when we look at what people hundreds of years ago did to come together, and I believe there's a really link between the culture, because again, what do we find in Africa? That very strong bond of villages and tradition. And again, I'm talking about what colonial powers weren't able to change, because that stayed very much, that's cultural. So people really coming together and helping each other and solving problems, take care of each other's kids, fixing roads, bridges. So that element you can really see in those early stages that has really built people buying freedom, saving for life, saving for dad, sharing resources, buying a tractor. That really was so critical in what the co-ops now exist. And then also seeing so many heroes. So every movement needs heroes. And so African American community in the cooperative sector, it's amazing how many heroes, not just small heroes in local, but people that have done remarkable things. Just to give you an example, in 1956, we at NCBA, at that time was called Cooperative League of USA, we hired a gentleman, he passed away last year at 95, Dr. Ali Felder. He, very young still, we hired him, and he went on to India to start probably the largest cooperative development program we've had in our organization. It was the pioneer of our work internationally. He was there 12 years. In those 12 years, he helped India to develop a cooperative strategy. He helped to put in place IFCO, which is the largest fertilizer cooperative. Started out with 57 co-ops. Now it has 36,000 cooperatives who own IFCO. He then went on to work on with the dairy and helped to promote dairy cooperatives. Now there's 100,000 dairy cooperatives there. 12 million members organized in cooperatives. He helped to attract credit unions to invest in India. He came back to US and he was our director of outreach for the whole world. So he did domestic work, he did international work, he did fundraising, and he helped a lot with cooperatives, including before the federation was formed. So someone that really has inspired us and has really helped us in international today to focus on what we do with cooperatives. We, over the last 60 years, have worked in 90 countries. We have about 400 programs with cooperatives of all kinds. Just last year, we work in 20 countries. We work with 9,000 different cooperative-type enterprises, grouping about 500,000 people, benefiting 7 million people. In Africa, primarily, where we really focus, people come together, again, they do savings cooperatives, very common. A lot of marketing. People come together to access markets, men and women, sometimes to share irrigation systems. We work with cooperatives in, for instance, in Timor, where one cooperative of coffee employs 3,000 people, the main employer in the country. So we see that cooperative solutions are widely used everywhere in the world. What I'm still trying to figure out is why is not used more. Yes, there are 100 million people here in America that are members of cooperatives, but most of them are in credit unions. You ask most Americans, most of us say, well, no, I don't know what a co-op is. Well, are you a member of credit union? Oh, yes, I am. Oh, okay, so, so there are obviously a group of people that are very informed, so we do have a lot of work to do. However, I do think that, frankly, I feel that, and I'm trying to see that it's not just us that believe in co-ops and like co-ops. I do think cooperatives have a lot to offer, but we do have to figure out how to package it. Jessica just mentioned that nowadays we're in another cycle similar to 1880s, very populist. So it's trying to figure out, okay, there are challenges, but there are also opportunities. We are seeing incredible movements of people coming together. We are seeing also a new administration that came in and promised the world. It has to deliver. So I'm trying to think, okay, there's 100 million people that are members of cooperatives. We need to mobilize resources, but not like $1 million. We need to mobilize serious resources for investing in communities, in particularly inner cities, and communities where there's high unemployment, there's a lot of issues. And this is not just a problem of an administration, I think it's a problem of America, of the country. So anyway, I just hope that between the lessons learned from our work international, a lot of the work that has been going on here, that somehow I think we have all the solutions, really. We just have to figure out how to connect the dots, how to figure out how to resource it, and then be ambitious and put forward a plan and start to work. And I know a lot of people are working very hard, but I think we have to work a lot harder.
Great comments. Again, Alex, as you talked, I just thought about raising the profile. You talked about raising the collective narrative of the power of cooperatives, which I think is great. And then once you do that, unlocking the opportunities with the cooperative model. That kind of brings me to my first question to you all, and anyone can jump in, or you all can jump in as you will. What have been or are the greatest challenges to the development of a sustainability of cooperatives and communities of color? And how can we address or mitigate them?
Well, I would just say in Pittsburgh, for us, what was important from the onset and what continues to be a major challenge is actually equity. So, for us, when we talked about having a marketplace, what we only were able to do was to establish like an open air marketplace and lease land from the city, and have been in this long process with the city, because in the neighborhood in particular, almost like 90% of the land is owned by the URA, which is the Urban Redevelopment Authority, which is this sort of independent arm of the city of Pittsburgh. And they have a process, right, that no real grassroots person or no real community person that I've seen has been able to really successfully go through this process and gain control to develop land in a neighborhood in which they have serious connection to interest in, and that's not necessarily about high profits and capitalism, honestly. And so we've been in this roundabout process for a really long time, and now we're deciding, you know, hey, let's try to find that very small percentage of privately owned land. But this is, you know, this neighborhood is prime property, and so because it sits between the highest generators of wealth in the city, which is the downtown Pittsburgh, and then Oakland, which is where the University of Pittsburgh, like CMU, those big schools are at. And so that's been the major challenge. You know, we pay really high overhead for our space, for our boutique program to, you know, be there, and we've become, you know, our vision has been from the beginning, and we see it being manifested now, is really about us being this sort of like regional destination. And so, you know, folks from around the world, when they're coming to Pittsburgh now we're seeing, you know, hey, like Ujamaa is the spot to be at. And so we're able to welcome folks and really engage people in dynamic ways. However, you know, as the person who's the administrator, I'm always like, because I just don't know in the next few years what's actually going to happen, because we don't own the land that we're on. We don't own the building that we're in. And of course, not like that ever was the end all be all, because eminent domain has always been the, you know, wield of the government, and that's what has happened in the Hill and in many places like the Hill around the world. But that does give you one extra foothold if you could own something. And so so that's really been the biggest challenge for us. And I think that, you know, doing, you know, I'm really excited to be here, because I almost kind of forgot how much you know, work that you all do around the world. And I've recently really kind of put my head screwed on in the direction of, you know, let's think about this from a more global perspective, because I think sometimes when we're just looking at the same people and the same circle around us, it's easy to forget that, you know, Black people are a global people, and that we're just really a displaced people. And so a lot of the things that we've done and that have worked are still are still working. And that, you know, there's no sense to recreate the wheel, but, you know, we may have some things here on this land that we can take over there to help tweak that wheel, and some really awesome things that we need to bring here and make happen. And so that's, you know, that's really where I'm at. But the challenge has really been in like owning property.
So just to be clear, equity in terms of being able to own, equity to purchase the land, or equity for operations? How do you?
All of it.
Okay.
Honestly, just completely honest, all of it. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think that, you know, being able to be in business outside of your local parameters gives you the power, I think, for us at least, the power to earn money that becomes equity to purchase, and also can help for us to raise the profile of what we're doing, and that, you know, the powers that be in Pittsburgh can recognize that they can't, you know, I think that they recognize who we are and they recognize the work that we've been doing, but I think that, you know, what happens often is that you hear about a meeting and everybody is there, and you recognize that you weren't invited to that meeting, you know, because for a number of reasons. But, you know, we're not necessarily, you know, the run-of-the-mill type of sister group, and we're known to go into a meeting. You know, we're very professional. However, we're also very honest. And we see things for what they are, you know, and bureaucracy is bureaucracy, and it's clear that, you know, we've been in a trajectory that is now taking us backwards, as Jessica had said, and and there's so much of sort of grassroots work that needs to be put back into place once again.
Thank you. Others?
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yep.
So one, I mentioned cooperative laws, and that's one of the major challenges. That is a big challenge. Cooperative laws are getting structured truly as cooperatives, where you can pass dividends on to members. But I also mentioned education, and not education of members, but education of other folks who you have to deal with, which leads me to like capital. For instance, there's a major challenge in getting access to capital and credit. Just being structured as a cooperative, and especially in the South. And we run into this all the time as an organization, where folks say, well, I don't understand how you're owned. There's not one person, and I can't give credit to you if there's not an owner, if you can't point to one owner. So there's challenges like that. And then a major challenge for us centers around credit unions. Alex, you talked about credit unions and the power of credit unions. So at the Federation, we talk about community development credit unions, financial cooperatives in our communities. At one time, about 15 years ago, there were about 18 credit union members that were part of the Federation, which represented a little over 10,000 members who controlled about $30 million in assets in their community, who loaned out roughly $300 million over the course of their existence. Now we have roughly 2 or 3 credit unions who are members, and they're primarily disappearing because of things like NCUA regulations that make them hard to survive because they look at camel ratings, they look at asset to debt ratio, and things that are important on paper, but not important for the community development side of things. And so you have credit unions who are being forced to merge, and when they merge, and I mentioned this, they lose their assets. They're not being asked to serve on these boards of these larger credit unions that they're being forced to merge with. And so you have communities losing large pieces of assets and wealth and the ability to loan to each other because of these misguided regulations.
So let me just go back to both of you all and maybe open up to Jessica and Alex as well. I've heard access to capital, just thinking about cooperatives and challenges, access to capital being an issue, raising the profile is an issue, equity being an issue. But those are synonymous with communities of color and not in cooperatives. Are there specific challenges within communities of color that have not been identified to date?
Well, in the research I've done, pretty much the issues that have been brought up by the practitioners are the issues. I mean, certainly, as I sort of hinted, I guess I said it a little bit, in my book I also came across the actual white supremacist terrorism. It's not as widespread as it was throughout history, but it doesn't mean it doesn't still exist in some form or other. So I would say we still have issues about white supremacy and terrorism and not wanting alternative black solutions to work. It's harder to point directly to them now. They're much more subtle, but they still operate. And some ways they operate are the access to capital, which even though you say it's a general problem for any co-op, especially any grassroots co-op, it's also a particular specific problem for people of color and African Americans in particular, because there are all these cumulative issues that come together with access to capital, right? So I do think that's still a huge issue. Sometimes I try to downplay it when I'm being Pollyanna-ish in terms of, well, we can get around the money if we have enough people who understand the model and put in the time and effort and use other resources, and that's true to an extent, but it certainly doesn't really solve the problem. Now, one of the ways we are trying to solve the problem, Cornelius and I have been involved with a group called the Southern Reparations Loan Fund, and that group is trying to use what's called non-exploitative capital to do lending. So taking public and private money, putting it into a loan fund that then loans out to very low-income co-op activities, especially people who have been rejected from regular funding, and to give it to them in a non-exploitative way, which means they don't actually have to pay it back if they're not profitable. They don't have super high interest rates. They don't have people saying you have to have one person's name as the collateral holder, that kind of thing. And then if you are successful, then you put money back in so we can lend that to somebody else, but we'll also be raising money in other ways to use it. So that's one of the things around that. I still also think that the ignorance, the low profile, the not knowing, the model, even though it's also a general issue, also has specificity in race because two things. One, because there's still the connection of co-ops with socialism, communism, labor unions, those have always been used against people of color more than other people, so that we've suffered more from having beliefs outside the mainstream in terms of political and economic retaliation against them. But also in our own communities, if you think about it, if you're already marginalized, low wealth, low income, you might not resonate to an alternative model because it seems to you it's the dregs, right? You want to be in the mainstream, right? You want a piece of the real pie, right? So until you can get enough, and so you're miseducated about what's the real pie, whatever. So until we can get the message out well enough about what is the real pie and why doing an alternative actually could be the best thing to do, it's hard to argue against that ideology.
Right. Thank you for that.
Let me piggyback on it for a minute, because Jessica talked about some things are subtle, but everything's not subtle. I was born in the South. I live in the South. And 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna die in the South. So there was a lawsuit. I mentioned the Civil Rights Commission, and I said the Civil Rights Commission talked about the reason black farmers, black landowners lost land, and the primary reason for that was the government. Was the government. And they said things didn't change, the government didn't change, there would be no black land by the year 2000. The government commissioned that report. All right? That was a black farmer lawsuit that came out. The President Obama's administration settled the last part of that. The government admitted to discrimination. There's a federal government, but there's also a local government. And in the local government in the South, it's controlled by local communities. And many times in our local communities, whether it be commissions, boards, or whatever, they're not represented by the community. And in the South, where we work, in what they call the Black Belt South, we have communities that are 70% African American. And if you go look at some of the structures that are controlled by the community, they're not controlled by the community. And those have effects, and that's the things that are not so subtle, and those are things that have been admitted. So yes, this is a general cooperative problem. You saw talking about access to credit. But it's also a specific problem that's specific to the African American community and other communities of color. So there's general and there's some specific also. But we have to work on those things collectively. We have to recognize them. And again, I mentioned the Federation, how the Federation formed for a reason, because it was the cooperative community and others that came together to create these structures. And we have to recognize things. We have to continue to work together to fight these economic exploitative systems and all the others. But we have to recognize them and recognize that everything isn't about this collective up here. There are things that are happening in the South that you still wouldn't believe.
Well, you just made a point too earlier. It was subtle, but I caught it that you said there are times where folks aren't being asked, when you referred to credit unions, folks aren't necessarily being asked to be on certain boards. You know, that's another way to express the value proposition of these collective economics and cooperative development that does not happen, that could happen. So thank you for that. So as we maybe flip the coin, we talked about the challenges, let's talk about the opportunities. So what exciting developments and or opportunities have you seen in the co-op development movement recently?
I don't want to take up all the conversation here.
You on a roll. Go ahead, Cornelius.
But I think there are many. I mean, you're starting to have conversions of factories and things where some of the businesses are going out of business and they're turning them over to worker cooperatives, and people are getting the opportunity to own businesses as cooperative structures, as workers. But there are also food co-ops. There's starting to be a lot of food co-ops and the interest in organizing food co-ops in communities they consider food deserts. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity around those things, and we're starting to see them in places like North Carolina, in Mississippi, in Georgia, and other places. So I think there's a real opportunity to start in Boston. There's a real opportunity for folks to start owning these structures in their community and provide themselves with the things that they need, and especially around food, which is very important. So I think that's one of the new developments that's exciting, that's starting to happen, and we're looking forward to the explosion of.
Do you what do you think contributed to them? I think you guys talked about the history and what contributed to co-op development over time. Are those the same factors that are contributing to these new exciting developments?
Yeah, I would say so. Need.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think we're getting the word out
Yeah.
more. I do feel like we're in another upswing for the cooperative movement, especially worker co-ops and food co-ops seem to be really on the rise. And I think part of it is we're getting the word out more. We are doing more education. My other two areas of opportunity, one is in the area of youth co-ops and education. And I think we need a lot more of it, but I think there's some great examples of doing co-op ownership and co-op development among youth. And I think that's a real opportunity because once we have, young people become adults. Right, we don't become young again, but they at least make it up into adulthood. And if they can grow up into adults, being people that are already cooperators, already interested in cooperation, already knowing how to do it, then we've made a huge gain there. Plus, young people bring families with them, right? Most of the time, that's how you can get adults out, is to support their young people. So when you're doing those kind of projects, you're educating their parents also. You're bringing the younger of the youth in because the young people bring young people in, especially to be sustainable. They need new voices, that kind of thing. So to me, that's a great ecosystem. And then the other project I've been working on is bringing co-ops, especially worker co-ops, to prisons, to prisoners, and to returning citizens. And again, especially we understand that we're the largest incarcerator in the world, right? What are we doing with people that we have now are the most marginalized, least appreciated? We can bring them some dignity and some economic ownership. I think that's another place, and we've got some great models to show how it's possible to do worker co-op ownership with people who are incarcerated.
That's great. Particularly those who, as they say, become a part of the permanent underclass because they don't have access to public housing,
right?
Can't get quality jobs,
Can't do anything. You can't get a job, housing. You can't vote.
That's right.
All those things, right?
So maybe two other questions, and while I'm teeing these two up, if you all can begin to get your questions together, we'll open up the floor and have questions from the audience. That's right. So if we maybe turn the page, I did some research this weekend, which is always dangerous, but I read a recent article about cooperatives and then also I was struck by the dichotomy of the percentage of the economy that Black purchasing power makes up, but yet a large portion of the Black community is in poverty. So in particular, according to a 2015 Nielsen report, Black buying power is projected to be $1.2 trillion and expected to be $1.4 trillion by the year 2020. But in comparison, if you look at poverty, African Americans in America, African Americans have a 27.4% of the community living in poverty, 3 times that of their white counterpart. Can the cooperative model help change this dynamic? Are there opportunities, and if so, how?
Well, I think that it definitely can, and I just there's a young writer in Pittsburgh named Damon Young, and he writes for he has his own blog I think called smartbrothers.com, and he writes for Essence and some other folks, and he actually just put out an article just a few days ago that talked about the sort of like this narrative that we play on Black people around, if only we spent our money better, we would be more wealthy, which is not really a direct line to what the answer is. It's really this sort of falsehood because it doesn't speak to how wealth is is built and how wealth is passed on, right? And so, and I tell people this all the time, and I oftentimes quote Malcolm X when I talk about this, because he has this quote where I believe his reference is a car, that if my grandfather had a car and your grandfather stole my car and then passed that car on to his son and then to his grandson, but I'm looking from across the street and I'm seeing that this was my car and my family, which was stolen, but keeps getting passed on, right? And then you're 3-4 generations later, right? And you're saying, oh, I have all of this wealth that we've been able to pass on, right? Right, this white family, and this son is looking at this son or daughter, right, of the black family, and the black family is saying, well, that was the car that my grandfather built, right? And the story and the legacy in our family was that this was the car that was built by my grandfather but was stolen and passed along, and then this is the car that was stolen and passed along, right? And so I think that we don't really, I think that we get caught up in beating around the bush in conversations that circle us in ways that don't really deal with the reality of the way in which wealth is built. And in America, right, wealth is specifically built around, we say, home ownership, right? So actually owning property and owning land property. And so if you're in a community like the Hill District, like I mentioned before, where you were, I mean, there are folks in the neighborhood who specifically talk about, I remember when I went outside and there was a notice on my grandmother's door that said you have 30 days to leave, right? And so if you owned your home, if you owned a business, you, in 30 days, how are you going to, relocate your business and all of its assets into a new place, right? And so people lost everything. And so if they weren't able to pass that wealth on, right, and then we say to those same families, oh, well, why can't you get yourselves together? Why, the bootstrap, this, that, and the third, right? But this is what we've been doing. And, but we're not telling the truth about what's been happening. And so I think that we have to start telling the truth. And yeah, I think that purchasing power is really important, and it can get us moving in some good directions. And so I'm all about buy local, but also the concept and practice of buying locally and acting globally. I think that for Black people, for us, we had the awesome opportunity at the end of 2015. We built a relationship with a group in Tanzania, right, which is our namesake, and traveled there and worked with some young people to produce our own brand of clothing, this is one of the skirts that we made. And so for us, it was important. How about we, because a lot of times, and I see lots of people, obviously, in this country say, okay, well, let me go to China because it's the cheapest way that I can get something made, right? And yeah, those Chinese people need jobs too, but there's no fair trade that's involved in that, right? And so for us, like, we really advocate in Pittsburgh. We talk about local and global fair trade. That is what we do, and that's what we're working on, right? Because we recognize, again, that the same issues of fair trade that we look at when we say, oh, I'll buy this scarf from this woman in Ghana, and I recognize, it'll help her, access clean water, and she can send her children to school, right? But some of those same conditions and quality of life issues exist in our own backyards. And you can look at Black families and see that we're dealing with issues of clearly Flint, Pittsburgh, right? Quality water, good schools, all of these same things. But we don't think about fair trade in those same ways, right? Like I think that oftentimes because of white supremacy and racism, it's easy to approach these things because we don't have to really deal with those people. They're more than an arm's length reach from us, right? I don't have to see them. I don't have to deal with their quality of life. I can hear about it, feel like I'm doing something good, and you are, but we don't approach Black folks and people who have a lot of the same cultural heritage who live right here in the same way. And so, and I think that's also, it's specifically because of, the elephant in the room. Like, we share the same history in America that we're not candidly speaking about around wealth and about work and about labor and the fact that we were the free labor for so long. And so I think that cooperatives are important. And for us in Pittsburgh, you know, like we are actually this spring launching a new program that we're calling the Aya Duafe Arts and Entrepreneurship Program for young women. And so we're focusing on young women between 15 and 21. And these are the girls who, because we, you know, our niche is in the arts, we're focusing on the girls who maybe not they're going to go to college, we don't know. Pittsburgh is a city of eds and meds, right? And most black women are working at the bottom of the ladder. So they are, you know, serving food in the cafeterias of these schools. They are the CNAs, right? When we talk about employment for black women in Pittsburgh, it's CNA programs all day long. And that's fine if that's what your passion is. But for a lot of black women, that's actually not their passion, but they're pushed in this direction to do this work. And so I think that one is, you know, helping to form co-ops in those sorts of spaces because, you know, I'm just like, wow, you know, if some of these black women recognize the power of cooperative business, they could edge themselves out of these sort of exploitative spaces where these businesses are really keeping them at like $7.50 an hour and they're not able to take care of their families at all. You know what I mean? And so these cycles of poverty are just going on and on and on. But for us, we're looking at this niche of arts and helping young women learn some different stuff around fashion design, jewelry, in the hopes that they will launch some co-ops out of our space. And I think that a lot of it also, I think the sort of soil is ripe because of sort of some of the social justice work that's been going on, and we see that, I think, more so with young people really leading a lot of these protests, a lot of these movements, and young black women specifically who are leading now. And so I think that they just don't have these models, but if we could bring that, I think we're going to see a whole new face of where, you know, co-ops can go in the next 10, 15 years.
That's great. Alex.
Yes, I think probably one big priority and that we should focus on is on the young people between 15 and 24, because I do think it's a really critical age and group, and that unfortunately school dropouts is a big problem, and that basically gets people to fail at an early age that then they go nowhere. So somehow we need to really tackle that. There's a lot of, the communities need all kinds of things. They need food, they need home-based care, so we need to figure out how the youth can, you know, with some additional skills. I'm not even talking about taking them to college. I'm talking about concrete skills with jobs that they can kind of get their self-esteem back, start relating to each other, and then can start acquiring assets and building a life for themselves. I think until we break that cycle, it's really a vicious cycle. And for that, we need resources. And I do think the idea of maybe the word restoration, a lot of it gets people, you know, and a lot of, particularly the white folks, get really preoccupied with that. But when you look at it, it's really what it is. So the idea of restoration, but in a very big way, not in an individual, like Jessica was saying, but in a collective way. There has to be some investment. So I think, again, 100 million cooperators in America. We should be able to raise $1 billion from just the people who are members of co-ops. We've got co-ops who are $40 million a year in sales. We need to figure out how to get some, to invest in cooperatives. And then we need to go, there's a lot of wealth out there in foundations. But I do think, again, we need to attract serious resources and then have a really serious roadmap to be able to start addressing these issues. And I do think the talent is there, the institutional capacity is here. It's putting it all together, which I find obviously very challenging. So
That's right.
Yeah.
So why don't we open it up for questions to the audience? There's a microphone here.
Well, is it on?
Yep.
All right. Well, first, I thank the panel. for bringing your insights today. As I was sitting and listening, and I was just reflecting, because I went back to a website and I looked at all the black cooperatives that were operating nationwide, even here in the District of Columbia. And so I marveled at that, that there were so many, so much of a movement. And I know a lot of it was relegated around segregation at the time, because we had to do business with each other. And so as we moved into mainstream America and got more integrated, you know, our businesses went, our economic power started to go sort of splinter out. But I would say this here, as I sit down and look today, it's really about education, capacity, and then scale. Because what I see not happening on the mainstream of America, particularly in community development corporations and national intermediaries, this discussion around cooperatives is not taking place. And so there has to be some form that we start to really deliver this information back into neighborhoods where people really can use the knowledge. So I would hope that at some point, some organizations such as Capital Impact or some other funder would sort of take a group of folks and take them around to certain cities all over and start sharing this information with grassroots organizations about cooperatives. Because this information in a silo is what it is, in a silo. And it's not really being used to its maximum capacity in terms of the business educating, nor business building out the model. So if not a question, but just a suggestion that we really have to focus, as Alex has said and been said here, on education. We got to build capacity for folks to deliver either financial or organizational capacity, because one of the things we talked about in the black community, we talked about food deserts, but there are organizations deserts in black community where there's no organizations operating at all. I see it in Baltimore, I see it here in DC now. So we got to build some capacity for groups to be able to scale the work, whether it's worker-owned cooperatives, whether it's food cooperatives, whether it's residential cooperatives. So those are just my suggestions for us to think about as we move forward this dialogue. We're going to be having a forum in Baltimore in March. We're going to convene a dialogue with some students and start to generate again. Professor Nembhard, thank you for the last time I heard you. You said education, and so I'm penetrating that whole education. Thank you.
Thank you. And just while we're going to the next question, I think it's important to your point. At Capital Impact, we're trying, as a financial intermediary, we're trying to raise the level of awareness to our philanthropic partners around food, around home healthcare cooperatives, around worker cooperatives. And as we talk about kind of creating equity and building community wealth, and you mentioned a cooperative, a lot of folks like, this is a great new idea. Well, it's not new in fact at all, but it's something that they haven't necessarily heard about in this context. So we think that we can add a lot of value in bringing folks to scale and having them invest in underserved communities across the country.
All right, thank you. Is this on? Is it? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I was waiting. Actually, I'm glad, LaKeisha, you're back on the stage. I think you three, no offense to you, but I think you three can relate to my question a bit more. Now, I know I've met Jessica a couple times for her Wisdom Circle. My name is Jessica as well, to have the fun. And just to let you know, brother, I am part of a group here in the district that's a lot of organizations, getting organizations together to build cooperatives, building a company called the Community Grocery Cooperative to build cooperatively owned and run grocery stores here in Ward 7 and Ward 8, which is an area of severe food access issues. We don't call it a desert, we call it a swamp, because there's an excess of options, but they're quite unhealthy, like a swamp. So my question, though, does go back to you all. As I look at this, I view, and I want to really kind of get your opinions on this, I view cooperatives as the future of global economics. And my question for you all is since we're talking about a lot about financing, education, which are two huge hurdles that we're dealing with, more the education side, educating our community on what cooperatives are. But think about finance and what you're reaching to, because we're getting to that place to have that concern. How do you feel, like on a global level or even on a regional level in the South, how a cooperative network can be used to actually pull away from money, currency, entirely as a system, as in trading within this cooperative network so we can pull away from the dollar and have a truly cooperative business network? How do you feel that we can grow and intentionally grow from where we are here today as we build more cooperatives to getting to that place to eradicate this finance system which didn't really exist and, well, it did exist, but generally wasn't this detrimental before 1492?
Oh, did you get rid of it?
I think that alternative currencies are really important, and I think that it is something that we should, as Black folks, look into. I don't know, just from my limited knowledge, I don't know necessarily because of our history and our current condition that we could just, at this moment, just be like, oh, you know, we need to do away with the dollar. I think that if we can have multiple currencies in play at the same time to because I think that trust is a really important thing, and I think trust and right, yeah, and that's a process, and it starts really small, but if you can have multiple groups doing multiple smaller group work and then build a larger network, I think that works better. Rather than trying to kind of institute this huge group of people. I think having multiple smaller pockets doing the same or like similar work and then putting that network together works more efficiently, because I think trust is definitely a major thing. I think that identity is like the major issue of the century. I mean, it's always been a major issue, but I think that it's the major issue of our time, because we just don't, you know, I think that a lot of folks are afraid of the idea of who we used to be and then of who we're going to be or who we are now, and I speak that in kind of generalities, but, you know, wanting to be African, are we African? You know, I had a young person ask me the other day, in our store, we sell a lot of African things, you know, clothing, artwork, and a young woman asked me who has, she's 19 and has, I think, a good social justice framework, but she doesn't necessarily have a cultural one. And so her question was, do people ask you about if you're authentic in selling something that is African and you're not African? And it was such an interesting question, because I said, well, no one's actually ever asked me that or asked us that. But I think that we have to really recognize, I think, history in a much more real and transparent way for us to get to where we want to go. Because I think that we get caught up in a lot of different things. And I think that there's, I think the best concept that I use and that I promote to people is the concept of Sankofa, right? To go back and fetch it. And so, you know, and folks rarely talk about that egg that is in the bird's mouth as we're flying forward and looking back, but the egg is the best of our ancestors. It's the best that we've ever done. And I think that if we can look back at some of the examples that have been the best that we've done and pull those things forward, and then also recognize that the creativity of African American people is phenomenal. That we wouldn't be here if it was not for our creative spirit, right? And like making a dollar out of 50 cents, and you know what I mean? You don't have 2 dimes to rub. So all of those things. So I think that when people get together and the energy and the spark is there, I think that we can do all kinds of things.
Great. One last, Jessica, and then one last question.
Yeah, I wanted to add, LaKeisha did a great job, but I wanted to actually give you a specific example of a hybrid barter system, just to show that people are trying to think about currencies and barter and co-op development. There's a construction company in Kansas City that actually started pretty much on a barter system in terms of sharing construction labor among themselves. So they helped each other to fix up either a bathroom or kitchen or to redo a house. but they were doing it as also a way to teach young people how to do it. So after the first 6 months to a year, they would then also, they continued to do the bartering over the weekend, but during the week they actually now had a cohort of people who could do the work and hire themselves out. So they created a co-op, so they're a co-op. They do work for hire, for pay during the week with a lot of the young people that they started to train, but they still do some of the barter on the weekend in terms of among themselves and in their community to help people. So it's not actually a currency, but it's a barter system, so it's a way to, right. So people could get certain work done on their own homes. Sometimes they needed to bring things up to code, but they didn't actually have to put out money to do it. So that's an interesting way, I think, to combine the two. The other thing I wanted to say to you is I understand that notion of trying to want to get out of the system, especially since the money system has been so oppressive to some of us. But one of the things that attracted me to co-ops was not so much that we could use it to get out of the money system, but that we could, again, use an alternative. I've really been struggling with how we talk about collective wealth and a sort of cooperative corporate ownership, meaning that we don't have to individually own stuff, but if our co-op owns it, and the ownership that our co-op has, either of the property or the equity in the business or whatever, if that can be used to leverage to make the lives of the members and the community better, then it's not that we have to make sure each person owns their own home or has $100,000 in stock, right? But if we have these really successful, lively, supportive co-ops that then can provide the things either to be doing community development or providing for its members, that should be enough. And then we don't all have to be grasping for this outside stuff that everybody's fighting and killing people over, but we're building communal wealth that then we can still pass on to our children, but it's supporting ourselves, our children, our families in a different way. And I know it's a little bit idealistic, but I'm trying to figure out how we can actually talk about it and then quantify it as a way to measure that level of collective control.
Thank you, Jessica. So this will be our last question before we close out the show. We'll be able to, the folks here on the panel will be open and hopefully be able to stay a couple minutes to address any other questions. But we'll have one last question, we'll close out.
I want to thank the panelists today. I want to quickly share an observation. Education is so very important. One of the things about African American people, as we well know, they were denied of their self-knowledge. So they wouldn't know anything about cooperative. As the young lady said, LaKeisha said, when we said COFA, go back and fetch that which we lost, then cooperative would come naturally. One of the things I think that we need to begin to do, cooperatives, it's a grassroots effort. One of the things I'm a believer in is that we have to go to our local government. As we go to our local government, when these folks run, we want to put that on their agenda, okay, and holding them accountable. Now, I don't know about this political parties that we have, Democrat and Republican. Me personally, I'm with Shirley Chisholm. I'm with the People Party, okay? And I think that's probably what we need to go back to today, is the People Party. But nevertheless, though, cooperatives address poverty, okay? Poverty. If we have local representatives and state representatives that do not represent their people, then it's time for us to take a stand today and organize a political cooperative and move their behinds out the way to address the poor.
So on that note, thank you for your comment. Please join me in thanking the panelists up here, and thank you all for attending today.